Welcome to Story Connections, where we discuss books and all the wonderful, exciting, frightening, and fascinating tales they present, and how all these things pertain to our lives. Now, here are your hosts, Catherine Townsend and Rebecca Guthrie.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Guthrie.
And I'm Catherine Townsend.
And this is Story Connections. If you want to connect with us online, you can visit us at whystoriesmatter.com or facebook.com/whystoriesmatter, or you can call into the show. The phone number here is 790-2040. And as some of you may be able to tell, I was given a cold by my son. He very generously shared it with me. So I apologize ahead of time if I start coughing. But this week I'm super excited because all of the books that we were talking about adventure books, and all of the books that we are talking about today were recommended by you guys, the listeners. People either put their suggestions at facebook.com/whystoriesmatter, or they were emailed to me at rebecca@whystoriesmatter.com. And I was pleasantly surprised because most of the books that people recommended were classic books, and we got lots of the same recommendations. So some of these books that you may have read already, and some of them are classics that you may not have read, but you know the story. But all of them, with the exception of one, were books that I had never read before, even though I knew most of the stories. So the first book that we are going to talk about is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. And the way that we are doing the books today is that we're doing them in publishing order, because I think that adventure stories inform other adventure stories.
Well, that's clearly true in the case of these books.
Right, which is why I decided to to talk about them in the order that we talked about.
But it's a fine pirate book, it is.
Yes, it is. And that is Harry. He is our engineer, and he's wonderful. But Treasure Island was published in May of 1883, and it is a first-person narrator story by the main character's name is Jim Hawkins, and he is a teenager who goes to sea to find treasure.
How much better does it get than that?
It really doesn't.
And what's great about this book is it just doesn't start off with he goes to sea to find treasure. First, he has an adventure at home that launches him into this adventure at sea.
So I will be completely honest. My introduction to Treasure Island was Muppet Treasure Island.
Well, at least it wasn't Treasure Planet.
Yeah, no. Treasure Planet, for those of you who don't know, it was the Disney's take on Treasure Island, and the only thing that is the same in it are the characters' names and the fact that they go looking for a treasure. Other than that, there's no similarities.
Right. And not even all of the names are the same. But.
Right. So I had never read Treasure Island. I knew the gist of the story because I'd seen Muppet Treasure Island. And yes, I can sing all of the songs from Muppet Treasure Island too. I won't, but I can. And so I was like, okay, it's an older story. I know the story. How enjoyable can it be? And I actually really, really enjoyed this story. I found Jim Hawkins' voice.
It feels modern, actually.
Yes. Yeah, I found Jim Hawkins' voice to be very engaging because it's a first-person narration. There's one small exception to that. There's a scene when he's not with his party and he has another person come in and talk about what happened so that you understand.
Stevenson has another person, not Hawkins.
Right. But Hawkins is saying that he wrote the book, and the doctor is the person that comes in to talk about here's how we got onto the island so that you know why the ship has been abandoned. And I thought, as an adventure story, especially as one of the, you can make some arguments about Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels as being the first more adventure stories.
Except that those really are social commentary, and they have a moral, right?
Which was what I was going to say.
And Treasure Island is just fun. Right. And for those of you who don't know what the plot is, essentially what happens is a pirate shows up at the inn that Jim's mom owns. He dies there. Other pirates come looking for stuff that he has. One of the things that he has, and the thing that they're looking for, is a treasure map. Jim figures out that it's a treasure map. He goes to somebody that he knows who has money, and the guy who has money funds an expedition to go find the treasure. And bad pirates find out that they're going to go looking for the treasure, and they sign on.
Are there any good pirates?
Okay, I don't know. I'm thinking these are pirates that are not retired.
Okay. Okay, well, I think
These
that
are
when you
active
say
pirates.
pirates, you mean that they're going to steal. So there are seamen who are or they're bad seamen or pirates. I don't know that bad.
All pirates are good except for the Somalians.
I don't know that I agree with you, Harry, and I think that a lot of people who
Pirates were privateers.
Well,
I
yes,
think
but
there's a difference
between
between a
privateer and
There
pirate.
is, I agree.
Because a privateer is a pirate who works for the government.
Not necessarily.
Well, you have to have a letter of marque.
Letter of marque, yes.
Right.
But
and
there are still good
truthfully,
pirates.
if we wanted to, constitutionally, we could still send out privateers
That's
because,
right.
we've got the constitutional authorization to do it, which would be an interesting
Philosophical discussion to have.
It would be. But in any case, finishing the story, they go looking for the treasure with a crew full of people who want to steal from them and kill them.
They want to have a mutiny.
Right. There is a mutiny. They get to the island. There's a mutiny. And the rest of the story is about how they recover the treasure and get home safely.
Right. And they do recover the treasure, and they do get home safely. But it's just a fun book. And the thing is that for being written in 1883, the language is not difficult. It's not a read that you would feel like you had to wade through.
I think a strong 11 or 12-year-old strong reader could read it without any problem at all. And a really strong 8 or 9-year-old could read it and enjoy it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
And there isn't anything in it that is objectionable.
No.
If you're okay with the whole, pirate thing.
Right.
Because pirates act like pirates.
Right. And people do die and people get shot and, they're being bad pirates. But there we go.
Right. Bad pirate. Bad.
Right.
I'm a good pirate, though. I do living history interpretation of piratical figures.
Okay, we'll let you be a good pirate.
Thank you.
So that's Treasure Island. And it was a fun, enjoyable read. And if you're looking for something to read on the beach this summer, yes, it's a classic, but I would take it with you because where else to read it than lying on the beach somewhere?
Maybe a cruise ship.
A cruise ship would be even better. Okay, so that's Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. The next book on the list is King Solomon's Mine by Rider Haggard, and that was published in 1885. And King Solomon's Mine, again, was a book that I could not read, and it is an adventure story in a very different kind of way than Treasure Island. It's much more adult. The basic plot is that the first person narrator, Alan Quatermain, Maine, is a hunter in Africa who hunts ivory, and so he goes around, and that's what his job is that he kills elephants and rhinoceroses and takes their ivory from them.
And to a modern reader, that's just horrible. It's just horrifying. So you have to remember that this was written in 1885 when nobody was concerned about conservation.
Right, when people, as they were, taming America West, would just shoot buffaloes out the window of trains just for the hay of it.
No, the reason that they shot the buffalo was to deprive Native Americans of food.
Well, yes, but there was an element of sport in it because they talk about there being a sportage
I understand that,
element.
But there was a purpose. There was an underlying political and economic motivation.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying.
But I still think that shooting animals, regardless, just to leave them dying, that you don't use their food, I think that that's wrong. I think that if you're going to kill animals, you need to do it so that you can use the resources that God gave us, not just for sport.
Okay, I don't disagree. I was just pointing out that ivory hunting and buffalo hunting are not the same.
Okay.
That's all.
All right. That's a valid point. Anyways, so this guy meets up with these other, so Alan Quatermain meets up with these other two gentlemen who are looking for one of the gentleman's brothers who went looking for King Solomon's fabled diamond mines. They believe that they can find them in the middle of the African desert, and they go looking for it. And Quatermain happens to have a map that was given to him by a Spaniard who was the Spaniard was given the map by his great grandfather. several hundred years ago. The Spaniard goes looking for the treasure, doesn't make it, comes back out of the desert, dies in Quatermain's camp, but he leaves them this map. So he has this map, and he's got somebody who's willing to fund the expedition. So they go on this expedition to find King Solomon's fabled diamond mines, and it is the story of them getting there. It's the story of them actually finding the diamond mines and what happens when they find the diamond mines, and then eventually they get home. And I thought it was and I don't mean this in a derogatory way at all, I felt like it was a very male story. I felt like young men and boys would really, really, really enjoy this based off of my knowledge of my brothers and my husband, but it didn't do anything. It wasn't an adventure story that did a ton for me. I mean, I can understand why people enjoy it and why people continue to read it when it was published, over 100 years ago, but I didn't particularly find the story compelling.
Well, I think that part of that is that the era that it was written and the author who wrote it were unabashedly masculine, right?
Yes.
So...
And I don't have any issue with it being a masculine book.
No, but what I'm trying to say here is that they were proving that they were men by what they were doing. Right?
Okay.
So they were conquering, right?
Okay.
Even though they weren't necessarily conquering land to hold it, they were conquering an idea. They were pursuing adventure for the sake of adventure and the rewards that being adventurous brings. And because it ends with them going home with great wealth, they're justified in what it is that they've done. And I think part of it, too, is that the native character, who turns out to be a king, has so much dignity, right? He's really treated with a great deal of respect in this book, which surprised me because, given when it was written, the fact that the author actually has the position that native people have dignity and worth, and some of them are worth more than Englishmen.
Yes,
he says that. It was really quite remarkable.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it's definitely a book that you should pick up and read. But I think that Catherine put her finger on it when she said that he's incredibly masculine and he's unabashedly masculine. And I don't have any issue with it. But I think men will enjoy this book more than women because men have that desire more than women do.
I think you're right.
We are up against a break. This is Story Connections, and we will catch you on the other side.
Promoting free enterprise and independent thinking. This is Tucson's intelligent talk station, 1030 KVOI, The Voice. Intelligent weekend talk that's live and local. Only on AM 1030 KVOI, The Voice. Call in now, 790-2040. That's 790-2040.
Hi, welcome back to Story Connections. We are talking about adventure stories that were recommended by listeners. So the next two books that we're going to talk about are The Princess of Mars and Tarzan, and they were both written by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And they were published right next to each other, which is why we're talking to them about them together, in addition to they had the same author. So Burroughs wrote Under the Moons of Mars, which eventually was retitled Princess of Mars, as a serial publication in 1912. And by the time that had finished serializing, he had written Tarzan, and Tarzan was published in 1914. So they were written basically at the same point, but Princess of Mars came first. And so we will talk about Princess of Mars first. Princess of Mars is a first-person narration by a guy named John Carter, who was in the Civil War, and after the Civil War ended, he went out west to Arizona, so there's a local connection.
Sort of.
To mine for gold. And when he was going to mine for gold, an Indian tribe finds him and tries to kill him, and they chase him into a cave, and he gets to the cave, and through means that you aren't really ever very clear about,
It's a miracle.
He gets sucked out of his body, and he gets transplanted onto Mars. And at the time, Mars was under the theory of the dead. Burroughs was influenced by the theory that Mars is a dying planet that had a harsh desert environment, and there was this was based off of the work of Percival Lowell, whose ideas were very popular at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century.
Essentially, people believed that Mars had been a living planet with water and agriculture and inhabitants.
Correct.
And that it was now a very old world, and that because it was so old, it was dying.
Yes. So Carter gets taken to this world. He runs into several species of aliens. The green aliens are big. They're not little green men. They're big green men who are warriors who are very primitive. And then there's the red men who have red skin, and they are not primitive, and they're much more humanoid because they have 2 legs and 2 arms, as opposed to the green guys that have 6 limbs. Their third set can work as either arms or legs. And it's his story of he falls in love with this princess of the red men, and he has to rescue her, and yada, yada, yada. And it was just recently made into a movie called John Carter, and the movie was a complete flop. And I don't really understand why they made it into a movie, because the story is incredibly boring. I was reading it this week, and I read 3 other books. I started this book, and I felt like this is so. I need to finish this because people recommended it. And if you recommended the book and you want to talk about it, why you recommended it, I would love to hear from you, because I thought it was really boring. So listeners who recommend it, please call in and talk about it. The number is 790-2040. But I didn't find the story compelling at all. I didn't care about John Carter. I didn't care about the princess. I didn't care about their struggles. I didn't care about the fact that Mars was dying. At the end of the book, this is a spoiler alert, everybody, the system that they have that controls the air goes down, and everybody's going to die, and I felt no sorrow about it. There was no part of this book that I found compelling. So,
okay, here's what I think. Because it was wildly popular at the time that it was written.
Yes.
Like, phenomenally popular.
Yes.
Like Harry Potter popular.
Yes.
And I think here's why. I can't think of another off-planet speculative fiction book that had happened before this one. And I've been thinking about what might have happened. Because there was speculative fiction, right? But I can't think of another off-planet speculative fiction book. And I think that tapped into something that people hadn't ever really thought about before.
So you're saying, from my perspective, in the 21st century, having read an absurd number of science fiction or fantasy books that are alternate world, in a world where we have Star Wars and
Right.
Star Trek, that part of the reason that I couldn't appreciate it was because I had too much
Exactly.
knowledge.
Right. It's sort of like,
And I had a hard time believing that Mars was dying because of the scientific. I had a hard time believing that Mars could be what Mars was
Right.
because of my
you
science.
didn't suspend your disbelief.
Right.
But it's sort of like, I remember when the first Star Wars came out. I was a preteen, and I remember standing in line, and I remember thinking how incredibly cool the special effects were, right? And when my kids saw the first Star Wars, they were like, that is so hokey. And looking at it from their perspective, it was. But at the time that I saw it, it was phenomenal, right? So I think there's the same kind of thing going on. What Burroughs was doing was unique. And it tapped into something in the human psyche about exploring space that hadn't been tapped into before.
I think that's actually a very, very valid point. And I also think that, at that point, we hadn't been to the moon. There was no space programs to speak of. And so it was the land of the world had pretty much been conquered for the most part. So this was the next thing to go out and be explored and conquered. I think
in many ways that's true. I mean, I think that stories that explore new worlds or unexplored lands are always, at least initially, something that people are interested in.
Well, it's the entire premise of Star Trek.
Right. Exactly.
And we should mention that, so The Princess of Mars is the first in a series called the Barsoom series, and it influenced a number of authors. I was actually, when I found the list of people who claim to be influenced by this book, Jack Vance, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, who's considered the godfather of science fiction, Robert A. Heinlein, John Norman, and then also Carl Sagan, says that he got into astronomy because he read these books as a boy, and he was so fascinated by it that it had a huge shaping force in his life. So Catherine's absolutely correct when she says that it was a big deal. So the next book that he wrote was Tarzan, and as I was doing my research for this, I did not know this, but Tarzan is other than Dracula, is the most movie-tized, that's not really a word, but dramatized. It's been turned into the most screen things. So in terms of either movies or TV shows or cartoons, that is the number one. It's the number two. Dracula's first and Tarzan is second. And I think part of that is because everybody, knows the thing. How many children have done that? But Tarzan is the story of a little boy, or he's a baby, that gets adopted by a ape, and
his parents are killed.
And he gets adopted by an ape, and it's his adventure of becoming an ape, and then discovering how to become a man, and then discovering how to become a civilized man,
and then deciding that really civilization is not all it's cut out to be.
Well, that's how the book ends, but if you read the rest of the series, that's not true. And I actually truly enjoyed this book. I knew the story because there are movies, and I'd seen movies. But I think part of the reason that I didn't like Princess of Mars was because I didn't find John Carter's voice very compelling. Tarzan is written in third person, so it's Burroughs' voice telling the story, and I felt like that was a better way of him telling the story, because I felt like as the narrator telling the story, he did a better job.
Well, I also think that it's a story that is not newer to you, maybe. I don't know exactly how to say this. So I feel like
it was easier for me to suspend my disbelief, because it was easier for me to believe that a baby adopted by a ape could do the things that he did than it was for me to suspend my disbelief and believe that a man could get sucked out of his body and put on to Mars.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm certainly willing to buy that. But I did enjoy it more. And again, it's not just like Treasure Island. It's a timeless story. You could give it to maybe not a strong 11 or 12-year-old, but you could certainly.
I think as a read aloud.
Oh, absolutely, as a read aloud. But I think some of the vocabulary it's very rich. The vocabulary is very rich.
It's word dense.
Yes. But I enjoyed it. I thought that.
Although, you know what? My mom said that those were some of her favorite books when she was a little girl, and she didn't tell me what age, but I had the impression that she was like 9 or 10 when she read them.
Okay. Well, I think that it also depends on how well schooled your child is.
That's probably true.
It was fun to read it because I knew stories from the movies, but I enjoyed the book because there was much more, I'd seen the Disney version of Tarzan, and like everything that Disney does, they sanitized it and changed it significantly. So it was nice as an adult to actually read it and see the differences. In the Disney movie, the parents are killed by a jaguar or something like that, and in the books, the mom dies because she just loses her mind and ultimately fades away. And the dad is killed by the ape, who is the pack leader of the apes that rescue.
Right, so they end up stranded because there's a mutiny on the ship that they're on. And the mom essentially loses her mind and gives up hope and fades away and dies.
So those were The Princess of Mars and Tarzan by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and we are up against a break. So this is Story Connections with Rebecca Guthrie and Catherine Townsend, and we will catch you on the other side.
Miss a show? Hear the podcast through our website, kvoi.com. Intelligent weekend talk that's live and local. Only on AM 1030, KVOI. The Voice. Call in now, 790-2040. That's 790-2040.
Hi, welcome back to Story Connections. We are talking about adventure stories this week that were recommended by you, the listener. So the next book that we are going to talk about is My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead, George. And this is a book about a 12-year-old little boy named Sam. I guess he's not that little. A 12-year-old boy named Sam who has been living in New York City in an apartment with his 8 brothers and sisters and his parents. So there are 11 people in the apartment. And he decides that he's going to run away and find his great-grandfather's old farm in the Catskill Mountains. And it's written in first person, so Sam is the narrator. He's telling his adventure. And it is about how he survives from May until April or March of the next year in the Catskill Mountains all by himself.
Now, it's not entirely fair to say that he runs away.
Well, that's true, because he tells his dad, where he's going.
Right. And people come to check on him.
Right. But he does most of everything by himself.
Right.
And I had never read the book before. I had heard of it. It was a Newbery Medal Honors book in 1960. And it was a really good book. But I want to talk about it in the context of parenting today. And I'm going to preface this by saying these are my opinions and only my opinions, but this is what I think.
Okay.
So I read an article that's linked at our website, whystoriesmatter.com, and it was written in The Atlantic, and it was about overprotected children and why that is a problem. And the premise of the article is basically that children are not given the ability to be children anymore because we are so concerned about making sure that they're safe that we've ceased to let them be normal children.
I'm not actually sure that I agree with you that that's what it...
Okay, well, that was what I took out of it.
Okay. So, I think that really what she was saying is we rob our kids of something important when we don't give them the opportunity to explore the world and to make mistakes and to get hurt and to learn that they can manage the consequences of mistakes and the consequences of being hurt.
Okay.
And, you know, I don't know how old she is, but I am quite certain that she's much younger than I am because her son is only 5, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's 5. So, you know, I remember having our housekeeper open the back door and say, "Go play, get out of the house, come back when the lights come on." And then my brother and I roamed our neighborhood with, you know, a pack of other children doing all kinds of things, building things, climbing trees, spraying each other with hoses, building forts, digging holes. And, you know, it was a world really very much populated by kids. But my children didn't do that. Well, they kind of did because they...
Yeah, they did. Yeah, we did.
But you didn't roam the neighborhoods.
When we were older,
well, yes, but not when you were 6, 7, and 8.
No.
Which is, you know, what I'm talking about.
Okay.
You know, by the time, if you could potty yourself, you were thrown out the front door and told to go play.
And come back when the lights came on.
And come back when the lights came on.
So, what I wanted to talk about, so My Side of the Mountain was published in 1959, and it is a story about a boy figuring out, really, that he can do a lot more than he thinks he can do on his own.
And solve problems and survive. And recover from mistakes.
Right. And as you were reading the book, there was a lot of how-to guidebook in this. You know, he talks about how to find food and how to skin deer and how he did what he did. And I don't know how realistic it is because I grew up in Tucson. I have never really been in forests. I've never been to Catskills, so I don't know how realistic this is. And a lot of the stuff that he was talking about I haven't seen, so I don't know. But I felt like if I had been a child who read this book when it first came out, I would have been very tempted to run away and take the book and see if I could do it. And I think, and Jean George even talks about this in the preface of the one that the copy that came out in 2011, which was the copy that I read, which was that she had people write her that said that they went to try to find the tree that he's talking about, the tree that he goes to look for to know that he's in the land, and then he lives in a big, huge tree. And I think that children need to feel like they can be independent. I think that children need to believe that they can do things on their own. And I think that in this day and age of helicopter parenting and of trying to keep our children safe from everything, that we are robbing them of the joy and the knowledge that they can be independent. And I also think that we have ceased to believe as a society that the right and normal thing for children is to grow up and become independent and to move out and have their own lives. You see that in the fact that 1/3 of young men under the age of 30 are still living at home with their parents. You see it in the fact that we've got, parents who are going in to argue with their kids' college professors about their grades. You see it all over the place. And I think that is a problem. And I think that part of why it's a problem is that we have become convinced that being alive is inherently dangerous. Living is dangerous. There is inherent danger in being alive. And we've ceased to recognize that there's just danger in walking out to the car, getting in the car, and driving away. There is a chance that when I leave the station, I am going to be hit by somebody and I am going to be killed. That's just part of life. But we've become so concerned about keeping ourselves safe, or at least having the illusion of safety, that we are robbing ourselves and our kids of valuable, enjoyable experiences because we don't want them to be unsafe.
Well, more than that, we're robbing ourselves and our children of freedom.
Yes, well, that was where I was going.
And I think that part of it is that we're not willing to accept any risks, even when those risks are inherent. And one of the things I'm thinking about here, and this article from The Atlantic made me think about it, is I got into a huge fight several years ago with a woman who was just so outraged about the tiger that killed those kids at the zoo in San Francisco. And for those of you who don't know the story, these two kids were at the zoo in San Francisco.
Not kids, teenagers.
Okay,
they
teenagers.
were 15 and 16 years old.
15 and 16-year-old people were at the zoo, and they were taunting the tiger and throwing things at the tiger. And the tiger got mad. And the tiger escaped from its cage, its pen.
It jumped over the moat.
Jumped over the moat, and it jumped over the fence, and it killed them. It mauled them. They died. Okay? And she was just
And they killed the tiger.
And then they killed the tiger. And I didn't think it was reasonable to kill the tiger for behaving the way that tigers behave, right? I figured it was reasonable for the tiger to kill the kids.
Were old enough to know better.
They were old enough. They did know better. They did know better. But their whole lives, they had been protected from natural consequences. So they didn't really think that there was going to be a problem, right? So she was just outraged, right? And when I said, when you go to the zoo, newsflash, there are wild animals there. Something could happen. You could get hurt, your kids could get hurt, somebody around you could get hurt, because it's inherently dangerous to go to places where there are wild animals. And if you're not willing to accept those risks, then don't go there.
Well, there was a court case not a couple years ago about, and this is truly tragic, they were at the mom and her kid were at a baseball game, and there was a fly ball that came back and hit her son in the head and caused permanent brain damage. And she sued the baseball franchise for pain and suffering and all kinds of things. And the courts ruled that she didn't have a right to sue them, that what had happened was a tragic accident. It was a tragic accident. But part of what you agree to when you walk into a ballpark is that you understand that they're playing with balls that are hard and going fast, and they could hit you and you could get hurt. And that's just part of the inherent risk of going to baseball games. And there's all kinds of things like that, but we have ceased to understand that those risks are risks that are just part of life. You know, we have become, you know, this will very clearly show my political leanings, but, you know, we stand up in airports like cattle and take our shoes off and go through machines that are toxic because we're trying to remain safe. Well, let me tell you something. They don't do any of that in Israel, and the flights in Israel and the lifestyle in Israel is much more dangerous than anything that's going to happen to you here. Part of living is recognizing that it's dangerous. And I think that part of why I really, really enjoyed my side of the mountain was because there was a recognition of, yes, this is dangerous, and yes, it could go catastrophically wrong. But it didn't. And frequently, dangerous things don't. And we can't not live our lives because we're so afraid that we're going to be hurt. And we can't not let our children experience the joy of going out and playing in the forest by themselves and running away from, you know, the bad guys, or playing Robin Hood because they could get hurt. Yes, kids climb trees. Yes, kids fall out of trees. Yes, kids break their arms. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to climb trees.
Right. I agree with you. But and I'm going to interrupt myself really quickly. The Israelis say about our airport security system that we don't have a security system. We have a system for annoying people.
Okay.
Anyway, but what I wanted to say here is, speaking as somebody who has raised 8 kids, there are things that I would have been willing to let my children do that I didn't let them do because there was a possibility that they would get hurt. And if they got hurt in that way, and then I had to take them to the hospital and explain that I let them get hurt because they were having, you know, grapefruit wars on the roof, for instance, I was concerned that CPS was going to show up at my door and take my kids.
Well, and I actually want to talk about that because I have a 19-month-old son. And I am terrified for him growing up in this culture because he's not going to be allowed. I'm going to have to work very, very hard to allow him to be a little boy because he's a little boy, and little boys run around and they get dirty and they hit people with sticks and they make guns out of, you know, pieces of bread, and that's just what they do. But in a society that says that being male is somehow wrong, and in a school system that says that you have to sit still and shut up, and that's the only way that you can learn, that there are no kinesthetic learners, that there are no auditory learners, that there are only visual learners, and there are only visual learners who sit still and are quiet, is appalling because it negates the things that make us different, and it inhibits our ability to make the world a better place by exploration, because part of how we become a more rich society is by having people who think outside of boxes. And when we say that everybody has to think inside the same box, we rob everybody. And it's infuriating, especially as a mom of a little boy who I know is going to have a horrible time in a traditional school system because he's, you know, not going to be able to sit still, nor should he. And he shouldn't be medicated because he's behaving like a normal little boy.
Okay, so on that note, I'm going to make a book recommendation, and I cannot for the life of me remember the author off the top of my head, but the title of the book is The War on Boys. And in The War on Boys, we're up against a break.
We're actually up against a break, but
I'll finish this story.
This is Story Connections. We'll catch you on the other side.
Intelligent Talk 24/7 on 1030 KVOI, The Voice, on the web at kvoi.com. Intelligent Weekend Talk that's live and local, only on AM 1030 KVOI, The Voice. Call in now, 790-2040. That's 790-2040.
Hi, Hi, welcome back to Story Connections. Before the break, we were talking about My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George, and we were talking about basically why children should be able to be children. And Catherine had a book recommendation off of my rant about boys should be able to be boys.
So I looked it up over the break, and the actual title of the book is The War Against Boys, and the author is Christina Hoff Sommers. And if you are the parent of a boy, you need to read this book. Period. End of conversation. You need to read this book. It talks about the fact that gender inequality in terms of girls underperforming boys is just a lie. Just flat out a lie. There is no measurement at this point on which boys are outperforming girls in public schools. And there's a reason for that, and it has to do with the fact that whether we like it or not, boys and girls are different, and they have different educational needs, and we're not meeting the educational needs of boys in preference of girls.
So there will be a link to that. It's not up now, but there will be a link to that book on our website, whystoriesmatter.com. The last book that we want to talk about is called The Blue Sword, and it's by Robin McKinley. And this is actually the only book that was recommended that we're talking about today that has a female as the lead character. All of the other stories have a male lead character. And The Blue Sword is a book about a orphan named Harry Crew, she's a girl, who goes to her brother who's basically living in this fantasy world. It would be the equivalent of she was living in Britain and she went to the Middle East in this world, and she gets kidnapped by basically Bedouins, and because the king who kidnaps her believes that she is magical, and it's about her adventure. And it was a story that I read multiple times as a little girl. When it was recommended, I had forgotten about it, and when it was recommended, I was like, oh, we have to talk about that book. I love that book. So it's a YA book. But it was a Newbery Honor Award. It was an ALA Best Adult Books, and it was an ALA Notable Children's Book as well. And it's just a fun adventure story about a magical kingdom where people make...
It's more than just an adventure story. It's a story of self-discovery.
Yes.
And part of what makes it significant is that it's sort of a parallel universe. So she is basically, I would say, Edwardian England.
Yes.
And there are restrictions on her because of her station in life and because of her gender. And as a result of the things that happen to her, she gets an opportunity to explore parts of her that she would never have been able to explore had she not been kidnapped.
Right. And I don't mean this there's a lot of baggage that comes with female power. When I say that, there's a lot of baggage that comes with this, but it's very definitely, just because you're a girl does not mean that you cannot do heroic things.
Yes.
And I think that just like boys need to believe that they can do heroic things, girls also need to believe that they can do heroic things, and that boys and girls are both capable of doing heroic things, that your gender does not limit you in what it is that in greatness.
Well, I think that's true. But I think rather than saying boys need to believe this and girls need to believe this, I think human beings need to believe that they can do heroic things.
And I think that's part of what we can take away from all of these books is basically, they're all basically ordinary people who end up doing extraordinary things in various ways.
In very different ways.
But they're all people who are presented with such a set of circumstances, and they rise and meet that challenge, and they are successful. And we as humans love those stories. That's the purpose of adventure stories, is knowing that we can meet those challenges.
Right. It gives you an opportunity to put yourself in a position that you probably are not ever going to be in and think about, what would I do if this were me, what would I do? And then if you are ever in that kind of situation, it gives you a well of vicarious experiences to draw on.
Yeah, and I think that that's why adventure stories speak to people. So with that, we are moving on to our book recommendations of the week. We'd like to thank our book recommendation of the week sponsors, David Guthrie with Coldwell Banker and Susanna Townsend with Susanna Lynn Photography. You can get their contact info at our website, whystoriesmatter.com. And we are looking for sponsors and advertisers. So if you like this show and you would like to consider being a sponsor, please contact me at Rebecca at whystoriesmatter.com. Also, if you like this show, as we add sponsors, please go support those sponsors, because that's a way that you can support our show, and we would really appreciate that. So, Catherine, what is your book recommendation of the week?
So my book recommendation is a book that is published by Blue Stocking Press, and the author is Richard Mayberry, and the title of the book is Whatever Happened to Penny Candy. And I love Whatever Happened to Penny Candy. When I was teaching economics, I always taught this book. And part of what I like about it is that it really doesn't matter if you're 8 or if you're 80. It takes complicated economic ideas and it makes them incredibly comprehensible. The format of the book is it's written as a series of letters from Uncle Eric to his niece or nephew Chris. You never actually find out what the gender of the child is, explaining how money works, explaining how the economy works, explaining in many ways how life works. And it's written from the standpoint of Austrian economics. It's not Keynesian, which is important to me because I don't think that endless government spending is a functional way for governments and countries to run, just like I don't think endless credit card spending is a functional way for families to run. So if you have ideas about how you think economics should work and you want somebody to help you articulate those kinds of things in terms of don't spend money you don't have, and there are economic rules, this is a book that I think you would be interested in. It's Whatever Happened to Penny Candy by Richard Mayberry.
So my book recommendation of the week is called Haroun and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie, and this is one of my absolutely favorite books in the whole wide world. And I'm going to read you the opening paragraph from the book because I think that it sums up the brilliance that is the writing in this book. So, there was once, in a country of Alf-Bay, a sad city, the saddest of cities, a city so ruinously sad that it had forgotten its name. It stood by a mournful sea full of glum fish, which were so miserable to eat that they made people belch with melancholy, even though the skies were blue. So that's the first paragraph, and it is a story about stories. It is a story about why we tell stories. It's a story about how silly stories can be and how wonderful stories can be. Haroun is a little boy whose father is a master storyteller, and his mother is his father's support network, and his father has started ignoring his mother, and so his mother is seduced away by an evil bad guy to go sing for this evil bad guy because her husband is ignoring her. And when she disappears, her husband is no longer able to tell the stories that he's supposed to tell, and so he and Haroun go looking for their wife/mother, and it is a epic adventure. It is a phantasmagorical adventure, and it's one of my favorite books in the whole wide world because the writing is clever and funny and interesting and intricate, and it makes you think about a lot of ideas. So that is Salman Rushdie, Haroun and the Sea of Stories, and you can find links to all of the books that we talked about at our website, whystoriesmatter.com, or facebook.com/whystoriesmatter. You have been listening to Story Connections. This week we've been talking about adventures, and we are so glad that you tuned in and joined us, and we will see you next week at 4 p.m. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.